The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard as James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what he thought would be another ordinary day of duty. Standing at 6 feet tall with shoulders that filled out his ceremonial uniform perfectly, James had been guarding Buckingham Palace for 3 years. His black bearskin hat sat firmly on his head, and his expression remained stoically neutral as tourists gathered behind the iron gates, cameras clicking away. James had always taken pride in following protocol to the letter. Every movement was precise, every step measured, and his face never betrayed even the slightest emotion. The other guards respected him for his unwavering dedication, and the officers praised his discipline. In his mind, being a Queen's Guard meant embodying the very essence of British tradition and unwavering duty. On this particular Tuesday morning in September, the usual crowd of tourists had gathered early. Among them was a family that immediately caught James's peripheral attention, though his training demanded he look straight ahead. The family consisted of a middle-aged woman in a wheelchair, a man who appeared to be her husband, and a young boy of about 8 years old who kept bouncing excitedly on his toes. The woman in the wheelchair had a gentle face marked by the telltale signs of a long illness. Her husband pushed her chair with tender care, stopping frequently to adjust her blanket or whisper something that made her smile. But it was the little boy who drew James's concealed attention. The child wore a small plastic crown that was slightly crooked on his head and carried a toy sword that was nearly as tall as he was. As the morning progressed, James noticed the family positioning themselves directly in front of his post. The boy kept staring at him with wide, wondering eyes, occasionally tugging at his mother's sleeve and whispering questions that James couldn't quite hear. The woman would smile and whisper back, her eyes growing misty as she watched her son's fascination with the guard. Around midday, something unexpected happened. The little boy suddenly stepped closer to the rope barrier and called out in a clear, excited voice that carried across the courtyard. He said he wanted to show the guard something special, something his mommy had taught him. James's training screamed at him to remain perfectly still, to ignore all interactions with the public. But something in the child's innocent enthusiasm made him listen more carefully. The boy began to recite a poem about brave soldiers who protected the kingdom. His small voice grew stronger with each line, and his toy sword moved through the air as he acted out the verses. Other tourists stopped their conversations to watch, some pulling out their phones to record the unexpected performance. The child's mother watched with tears streaming down her face, her hand pressed to her heart. James felt something stirring inside him that he had never experienced during his years of service. This wasn't just a tourist seeking attention or trying to make him break character for a funny photo. This was a child sharing something precious, something that clearly meant the world to both him and his mother. The poem spoke of honor, bravery, and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. When the boy finished his recitation, he stood at attention and gave James the most serious, respectful salute his small arms could manage. The courtyard fell silent except for the distant sounds of London traffic. James could feel dozens of eyes watching him, waiting to see how he would respond. Protocol dictated that he should remain motionless, give no acknowledgement, and continue his duty as if nothing had happened. But as James looked down at this brave little boy who had clearly practiced this moment, and then glanced at the woman in the wheelchair whose eyes held a mixture of hope and resignation, he felt his rigid training begin to waver. There was something about this family that spoke to a deeper part of his humanity, something that made him question whether following rules was always more important than showing basic human kindness. The boy held his salute for a full minute, his small arm trembling with the effort but his determination unwavering. His father placed a gentle hand on the woman's shoulder, and James could see that this moment was about more than just a child's fascination with palace guards. This was about a family creating a memory, about a mother watching her son experience something that filled him with joy and wonder. James remained frozen in his position, but inside, a battle was raging between his sense of duty and his growing desire to acknowledge this special moment. He had never faced such a dilemma during his service. Every instinct told him that breaking protocol could result in disciplinary action, possibly even dismissal from the prestigious position he had worked so hard to achieve. The tourists around the family began to murmur, some expressing disappointment that the guard wasn't responding to such a sweet gesture. Others defended the tradition, explaining that the guards were trained never to break character. But the little boy remained in his salute position, his face showing no sign of giving up. As the minutes ticked by, James found himself thinking about why he had wanted to become a Queen's Guard in the first place. It wasn't just about the honor and tradition, though those things mattered deeply to him. It was also about service, about protecting and representing something greater than himself. But standing there, looking at this family who had clearly planned this special moment, he began to wonder if true service sometimes meant showing compassion rather than just following rules. The woman in the wheelchair whispered something to her husband, who nodded and began to wheel her chair back slightly. It was clear they were preparing to leave, understanding that the guard couldn't respond. But the little boy remained where he was, his salute never wavering, his belief in the magic of the moment still intact. James realized that in the next few seconds, he would have to make a choice that would define not just this moment, but possibly his entire understanding of what it meant to serve with honor. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard as James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what he thought would be another ordinary day of duty. Standing at 6 feet tall with shoulders that filled out his ceremonial uniform perfectly, James had been guarding Buckingham Palace for 3 years. His black bearskin hat sat firmly on his head, and his expression remained stoically neutral as tourists gathered behind the iron gates, cameras clicking away. James had always taken pride in following protocol to the letter. Every movement was precise, every step measured, and his face never betrayed even the slightest emotion. The other guards respected him for his unwavering dedication, and the officers praised his discipline. In his mind, being a Queen's Guard meant embodying the very essence of British tradition and unwavering duty. On this particular Tuesday morning in September, the usual crowd of tourists had gathered early. Among them was a family that immediately caught James's peripheral attention, though his training demanded he look straight ahead. The family consisted of a middle-aged woman in a wheelchair, a man who appeared to be her husband, and a young boy of about 8 years old who kept bouncing excitedly on his toes. The woman in the wheelchair had a gentle face marked by the telltale signs of a long illness. Her husband pushed her chair with tender care, stopping frequently to adjust her blanket or whisper something that made her smile. But it was the little boy who drew James's concealed attention. The child wore a small plastic crown that was slightly crooked on his head and carried a toy sword that was nearly as tall as he was. As the morning progressed, James noticed the family positioning themselves directly in front of his post. The boy kept staring at him with wide, wondering eyes, occasionally tugging at his mother's sleeve and whispering questions that James couldn't quite hear. The woman would smile and whisper back, her eyes growing misty as she watched her son's fascination with the guard. Around midday, something unexpected happened. The little boy suddenly stepped closer to the rope barrier and called out in a clear, excited voice that carried across the courtyard. He said he wanted to show the guard something special, something his mommy had taught him. James's training screamed at him to remain perfectly still, to ignore all interactions with the public. But something in the child's innocent enthusiasm made him listen more carefully. The boy began to recite a poem about brave soldiers who protected the kingdom. His small voice grew stronger with each line, and his toy sword moved through the air as he acted out the verses. Other tourists stopped their conversations to watch, some pulling out their phones to record the unexpected performance. The child's mother watched with tears streaming down her face, her hand pressed to her heart. James felt something stirring inside him that he had never experienced during his years of service. This wasn't just a tourist seeking attention or trying to make him break character for a funny photo. This was a child sharing something precious, something that clearly meant the world to both him and his mother. The poem spoke of honor, bravery, and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. When the boy finished his recitation, he stood at attention and gave James the most serious, respectful salute his small arms could manage. The courtyard fell silent except for the distant sounds of London traffic. James could feel dozens of eyes watching him, waiting to see how he would respond. Protocol dictated that he should remain motionless, give no acknowledgement, and continue his duty as if nothing had happened. But as James looked down at this brave little boy who had clearly practiced this moment, and then glanced at the woman in the wheelchair whose eyes held a mixture of hope and resignation, he felt his rigid training begin to waver. There was something about this family that spoke to a deeper part of his humanity, something that made him question whether following rules was always more important than showing basic human kindness. The boy held his salute for a full minute, his small arm trembling with the effort, but his determination unwavering. His father placed a gentle hand on the woman's shoulder, and James could see that this moment was about more than just a child's fascination with palace guards. This was about a family creating a memory, about a mother watching her son experience something that filled him with joy and wonder. James remained frozen in his position, but inside, a battle was raging between his sense of duty and his growing desire to acknowledge this special moment. He had never faced such a dilemma during his service. Every instinct told him that breaking protocol could result in disciplinary action, possibly even dismissal from the prestigious position he had worked so hard to achieve. The tourists around the family began to murmur, some expressing disappointment that the guard wasn't responding to such a sweet gesture. Others defended the tradition, explaining that the guards were trained never to break character. But the little boy remained in his salute position, his face showing no sign of giving up. As the minutes ticked by, James found himself thinking about why he had wanted to become a Queen's Guard in the first place. It wasn't just about the honor and tradition, though those things mattered deeply to him. It was also about service, about protecting and representing something greater than himself. But standing there, looking at this family who had clearly planned this special moment, he began to wonder if true service sometimes meant showing compassion rather than just following rules. The woman in the wheelchair whispered something to her husband, who nodded and began to wheel her chair back slightly. It was clear they were preparing to leave, understanding that the guard couldn't respond. But the little boy remained where he was, his salute never wavering, his belief in the magic of the moment still intact. James realized that in the next few seconds, he would have to make a choice that would define not just this moment, but possibly his entire understanding of what it meant to serve with honor. 3 months after his encounter with the little boy and his family, James found himself assigned to a different post at Windsor Castle. The change in location came with new responsibilities and a fresh perspective on his role as a Queen's Guard. Windsor's atmosphere was somehow more intimate than Buckingham Palace, with its ancient stone walls and sprawling grounds that seemed to whisper stories of centuries past. On a crisp November morning, James was stationed near the castle's main entrance when he noticed an unusual commotion developing near the visitors' area. A group of elderly people, clearly part of an organized tour, had gathered around an old man who appeared to be in distress. The man, probably in his 80s, was leaning heavily on his walking stick and seemed to be having difficulty breathing. James watched from his position as the tour guide tried to help, but it was obvious that the situation was becoming more serious by the minute. The elderly gentleman's face had gone pale and his companions were growing increasingly worried. The tour guide was young and clearly inexperienced in handling medical emergencies, frantically looking around for assistance while trying to keep the rest of the group calm. Protocol dictated that James should maintain his position and alert security through proper channels if necessary. Medical emergencies were supposed to be handled by trained personnel, not by guards who were meant to remain at their posts. But as James watched the situation unfold, he remembered the lesson he had learned about balancing duty with compassion. The elderly man suddenly stumbled, and only the quick action of another tour member prevented him from falling to the ground. James could see that the man was struggling to speak, gasping for breath between words. The tour guide was speaking rapidly into her radio, but James realized that help might not arrive in time, and the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Making a split-second decision, James stepped away from his post and approached the group. His imposing presence in the red tunic and bearskin hat immediately commanded attention, and the worried tourists stepped aside to give him access to the elderly gentleman. James knelt down beside the man, his military training in first aid taking over as he assessed the situation. The man's breathing was labored and irregular, and James could see the classic signs of what appeared to be a panic attack, complicated by some underlying respiratory condition. Speaking in calm, measured tones, James introduced himself and asked the man his name. The gentleman managed to whisper that his name was Arthur, and that he was a retired Royal Navy officer who had served during the Falklands conflict. James immediately understood the significance of this information. Arthur wasn't just a tourist having a medical episode. He was a veteran who had served his country with honor. The knowledge seemed to intensify James's determination to help. creating an immediate bond between two men who had dedicated their lives to service, though from different generations. Working with gentle efficiency, James helped Arthur sit down on a nearby bench and guided him through breathing exercises that he had learned during his own military training. He spoke to Arthur about shared experiences of service, using the conversation to help the older man focus on something other than his breathing difficulties. James asked about Arthur's naval service, encouraging him to share stories as a way of regulating his breathing naturally. As they talked, Arthur's breathing gradually became more regular, and some color returned to his cheeks. The old sailor began to tell James about his time aboard HMS Sheffield's sister ship and how he had lost friends during the conflict. James listened with genuine interest, his presence providing both medical assistance and emotional support to a fellow serviceman in distress. The tour group watched in amazement as the imposing guard, who had seemed like a statue just minutes before, demonstrated incredible gentleness and compassion. Several members of the group were quietly wiping away tears as they witnessed this unexpected display of human kindness from someone they had assumed was merely decorative. When the medical team finally arrived, Arthur was breathing normally and was able to walk to their vehicle with minimal assistance. Before leaving, the elderly veteran grasped James's hand firmly and thanked him with tears in his eyes. Arthur said that in all his years of service, he had learned to recognize true character, and that James embodied everything that was good about the military tradition they both served. The incident was reported to James's superiors, but this time the response was entirely different from his previous breach of protocol. Captain Morrison, the commanding officer at Windsor, called James into his office not for discipline but for commendation. Morrison explained that James's actions perfectly exemplified the highest ideals of service and that helping a veteran in distress was entirely consistent with the values the Guard was meant to represent. Captain Morrison revealed that Arthur had written a letter to the palace, expressing his gratitude and praising the professionalism and compassion shown by the Guard. The letter had made its way up the chain of command and had been received very positively at the highest levels. Morrison told James that true leadership meant knowing when to follow orders exactly and when to use judgment to serve a higher purpose. The story of James's assistance to Arthur spread quickly among the guards, creating a new understanding of how tradition and compassion could work together, rather than in opposition. Other guards began to share their own experiences of times when they had struggled with similar decisions, and a more nuanced discussion emerged about how to serve with both discipline and humanity. James learned that Arthur had returned to the castle 2 weeks later with his adult daughter, specifically asking to thank the guard who had helped him. When they were told that guards couldn't be identified individually for security reasons, Arthur had left a small commemorative coin from his naval service, asking that it be given to the guard who had shown such kindness to an old sailor. Holding that coin in his hands, James realized that his understanding of service had evolved significantly since his early days as a guard. He was beginning to see that the highest form of duty wasn't blind obedience to rules, but rather the wisdom to know when those rules served their purpose and when human needs required a different response. The experience with Arthur taught James that being a protector meant more than just standing guard against physical threats. Sometimes it meant recognizing when someone needed help, regardless of whether that assistance fell within the strict boundaries of one's official duties. It was about understanding that true strength often revealed itself through gentleness and that the most memorable acts of service were often the most human ones. Winter had settled over London with unusual severity, bringing with it temperatures that hadn't been seen in decades. James found himself back at Buckingham Palace for the Christmas season, a time when tourist numbers traditionally swelled despite the cold weather. The festive atmosphere around the palace was magical, with holiday lights reflecting off the snow-covered streets and the sound of Christmas carols drifting through the crisp air. On December 23rd, James was assigned to the early morning shift, beginning his duty before dawn, in what would prove to be one of the coldest days of the year. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and even with his wool uniform and thermal undergarments, James could feel the bitter cold seeping through to his bones. His breath created small clouds in the frigid air, and frost had begun to form on the metal fixtures of his rifle. As the morning progressed and tourists began to gather, James noticed that the usual crowds were much smaller than normal. Most sensible people had chosen to stay indoors rather than venture out into the harsh weather. However, one figure caught his attention and held it with growing concern. Near the palace gate stood a young woman, probably in her early 20s, who was clearly not dressed appropriately for the extreme weather. She wore only a thin jacket over what appeared to be work clothes, and James could see her shivering violently from his position. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint, and she kept stamping her feet and rubbing her hands, together in a desperate attempt to generate warmth. What made the situation even more concerning was that the woman had been standing in the same spot for over 2 hours. James had watched her arrive before the sun came up, and she hadn't moved from her position except to shift her weight from foot to foot. She wasn't taking pictures like a typical tourist, nor was she part of any group. Instead, she seemed to be waiting for something or someone, her eyes constantly scanning the area around the palace. As his shift continued, James became increasingly worried about the young woman's welfare. The temperature continued to drop, and weather reports on his radio indicated that conditions were becoming dangerous for anyone exposed to the elements for extended periods. The woman's shivering had become more violent, and James noticed that she was having difficulty controlling her movements. During a brief moment when foot traffic was particularly light, James made a decision that would have been unthinkable to him a year earlier. He caught the woman's attention with a subtle gesture and quietly asked if she was all right. His voice was low enough that other tourists wouldn't hear, but clear enough that she understood his concern. The young woman looked startled that the guard had spoken to her, and for a moment she seemed unable to respond. When she finally found her voice, she explained in heavily accented English that she was waiting for her sister, who worked in one of the government buildings nearby. She had come to London from Romania just 2 days earlier and had been told to wait at this specific location, but she didn't have enough money for warm clothes or indoor shelter. James felt his heart sink as he listened to her story. The woman, whose name was Elena, had traveled to London to start a new job, but there had been a miscommunication about when and where she was supposed to meet her sister. She had been waiting since early morning because she was afraid that if she left, she would miss the connection and wouldn't know how to find her sister in the vast city. The situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. Elena was showing clear signs of hypothermia, and James knew that she needed immediate shelter and warmth. However, his position as a guard made it impossible for him to leave his post to escort her to safety. The protocol was clear. Guards were not to abandon their positions under any circumstances, and becoming involved in tourists' personal problems was strictly forbidden. But as James watched Elena struggle to maintain her composure while her body was clearly failing her, he realized that this wasn't about protocol anymore. This was about a human being in genuine danger, someone who might suffer serious injury or worse if immediate action wasn't taken. The choice between following rules and potentially saving a life wasn't really a choice at all. James made eye contact with a colleague positioned across the courtyard and used subtle hand signals to indicate that there was a situation requiring attention. His fellow guard, understanding the urgency, discreetly moved closer to observe the situation. Meanwhile, James continued to monitor Elena, who was now struggling to remain upright. Using his radio in a way that wouldn't draw attention from tourists, James contacted the palace security office and reported a possible medical emergency. He described Elena's condition and location without explicitly stating that he had spoken to her. Within minutes, a plainclothes security officer approached the area, ostensibly as part of a routine patrol. James then did something that pushed the boundaries of his role even further. He discreetly signaled to Elena, indicating that she should approach the security officer who was now positioned nearby. When she hesitated, clearly confused and frightened, James used gentle gestures to reassure her and guide her toward the help that was available. The security officer, a woman named Sarah, who had worked at the palace for several years, immediately recognized the severity of Elena's condition. Sarah had been briefed by James's radio call and was prepared to provide assistance. She approached Elena with warmth and professionalism, speaking in calm, reassuring tones as she guided the young woman toward the security office. As they walked away, Elena turned back toward James with gratitude shining in her eyes. She couldn't speak loudly enough for him to hear without drawing unwanted attention, but her expression conveyed everything she wanted to say. James maintained his stoic exterior, but inwardly he felt a deep sense of relief that she was finally receiving the help she desperately needed. Later that afternoon, James learned through the security network that Elena had indeed been suffering from the early stages of hypothermia when Sarah found her. The medical team had warmed her up, provided hot drinks and food, and helped her contact her sister. The miscommunication had been resolved, and Elena was safely reunited with her family member. What struck James most about the incident was how Elena's sister had reacted when she learned about the guards' intervention. The sister, who spoke better English, had insisted on writing a formal thank you letter to the palace, expressing her family's gratitude for the compassion shown to Elena during her moment of greatest need. The letter made its way to Captain Morrison, who called James in for what had become an increasingly familiar conversation about balancing duty with humanity. However, this time Morrison's tone was different. He explained that James had handled the situation with exactly the kind of judgment and discretion that the service hoped to see in its most promising guards. Morrison revealed that there had been discussions at senior levels about the changing role of the Queen's Guard in modern society. While maintaining tradition and protocol remained essential, there was growing recognition that the most effective guards were those who could adapt to unexpected situations while maintaining their core values and dignity. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it renewed energy and a fresh assignment that would test everything James had learned about balancing tradition with compassion. He was selected to be part of a special ceremonial guard detail for a charity event being held in the gardens of Kensington Palace. The event was particularly meaningful as it supported military veterans and their families, bringing together people from all walks of life who had been touched by military service. The charity event attracted an unusual mix of attendees, including war veterans, military families, celebrities, and members of the public who had purchased tickets to support the cause. James and his fellow guards were positioned around the garden perimeter, their role being largely ceremonial, but requiring the same level of discipline and professionalism as any other duty. Among the crowd, James noticed a middle-aged woman moving slowly through the gathering with the help of a walking frame. She was accompanied by a younger man who appeared to be her adult son, and both were dressed formally for the occasion. What caught James's attention was not their appearance, but rather the woman's obvious determination to participate fully in the event, despite her physical limitations. As the afternoon progressed, James observed the woman whose name tag read Margaret, stopping to speak with various veterans and their families. Her conversations were animated and heartfelt, and it became clear that she was not just attending the event, but was somehow central to its organization. Other attendees approached her with obvious respect and affection, and James began to understand that Margaret held a special place within this community. During the formal presentations, James learned Margaret's story through the speeches being given on the small stage. She was the widow of a soldier who had been killed in Afghanistan, leaving her to raise their son alone while dealing with her own service-related injuries sustained during her deployment as a military nurse. Despite facing enormous challenges, Margaret had dedicated her life to supporting other military families, eventually founding the charity that was hosting this event. What made Margaret's story even more remarkable was that she had developed a progressive neurological condition that was gradually robbing her of her mobility and independence. The doctors had told her that this would likely be her last year of being able to participate actively in the charity's events, which explained the special significance of this particular gathering. As the afternoon wore on, James noticed that Margaret was tiring visibly. Her son was attentive and supportive, but it was clear that she was determined to stay until the very end of the event, even though the physical strain was becoming obvious. She had stopped using her walking frame and was leaning heavily on her son's arm, but her smile never wavered as she continued to greet guests and participate in the festivities. Near the end of the event, disaster struck in a way that no one could have anticipated. Margaret's son had stepped away briefly to get her a chair when she suddenly lost her balance on the uneven garden path. James watched in horror as she began to fall, her compromised mobility making it impossible for her to catch herself. Without thinking, James broke from his position and moved swiftly across the garden. He reached Margaret just in time to prevent her from hitting the ground, catching her gently and supporting her weight as she regained her composure. The action happened so quickly that most of the crowd didn't immediately realize what had occurred. But those nearby had witnessed the guard's quick intervention. Margaret looked up at James with surprise and gratitude, her eyes reflecting both embarrassment at her stumble and appreciation for his assistance. James helped her to a nearby chair, his movements careful and respectful as he ensured she was comfortable and uninjured. Margaret's son returned just as James was stepping back, and the relief on his face was evident as he realized what had happened. What occurred next surprised everyone, including James. Margaret reached out and grasped his hand, speaking in a voice that carried across the garden despite its softness. She thanked him not just for catching her fall, but for reminding everyone present that true service meant being ready to help others regardless of the circumstances. Her words transformed what could have been an embarrassing incident into a powerful moment that perfectly embodied the spirit of the charity event. The crowd that had gathered around them began to applaud, not for the spectacle, but for the genuine human compassion they had witnessed. Several veterans in the crowd nodded their approval, recognizing in James's actions the same selfless service that had defined their own military careers. The moment became a bridge between the formal ceremony and the personal connections that made the event meaningful. Margaret insisted that James remain nearby as she gave her closing remarks to the assembled crowd. Standing beside her chair, still in full ceremonial dress, James found himself part of a speech that would be remembered by everyone present. Margaret spoke about the importance of community, about how small acts of kindness created ripples that extended far beyond their immediate impact. She used James's assistance as an example of how military values, honor, duty, and service were not just abstract concepts but living principles that guided actions in everyday situations. Her words gave deeper meaning to his decision to break protocol, framing it not as rule-breaking but as the highest expression of military values. After the event concluded, Margaret's son approached James privately to express his family's gratitude. He explained that his mother had been worried about attending the event because of her increasing physical limitations, but that James's quick action had prevented what could have been a serious injury. More importantly, the way the incident had been handled had turned a moment of vulnerability into one of strength and connection. The charity event became a turning point in how James understood his role as a Queen's Guard. He realized that the uniform he wore represented more than just tradition and ceremony. It represented the values and character of the people who wore it. When those values aligned with human need, choosing compassion over rigid protocol wasn't breaking the rules, it was fulfilling the highest purpose of service. Captain Morrison's response to the incident confirmed this understanding. Rather than facing discipline, James was commended for his quick thinking and his representation of the finest traditions of military service. Morrison explained that the royal family had been informed of the incident and had expressed approval of the guard's actions. The event also led to an unexpected opportunity. Margaret's charity approached the palace about establishing a regular partnership, with guards occasionally participating in veteran support events. The proposal was accepted, creating a new avenue for the Queen's Guard to serve the community while maintaining their traditional roles. 2 years had passed since James first learned to balance duty with compassion, and his reputation within the Queen's Guard had evolved considerably. He was now recognized not just as a disciplined soldier, but as someone who embodied the finest qualities of military service. His experiences had shaped him into a leader among his peers, and younger guards often sought his guidance on how to handle challenging situations with both honor and humanity. On a warm July morning, James received an assignment that would bring his journey full circle in the most unexpected way. He was to be part of a special ceremony honoring military families, and among the guests of honor was the same family he had saluted 2 years earlier. The woman in the wheelchair, her husband, and their son, now 10 years old and taller but with the same bright enthusiasm in his eyes. The reunion was arranged carefully through official channels, as Margaret's charity had maintained contact with the palace and had specifically requested that the guard who had helped the little boy be present for this special recognition ceremony. The boy, whose name was Thomas, had become something of a symbol for the charity's youth programs, representing the importance of inspiring the next generation to understand and appreciate military service. James learned that Thomas's mother, Sarah, had been battling cancer for several years, and her condition had been particularly difficult during the time of their first visit to the palace. The family's request to create a special memory for Thomas had been driven by the uncertainty surrounding her health and their desire to give their son an experience that would stay with him forever. The ceremony was designed to honor military families and the sacrifices they made, with particular emphasis on the children who grew up understanding that their parents served something larger than themselves. Sarah had been invited to speak about her experience as a military spouse and the importance of creating positive memories, even during challenging times. When Thomas saw James in his ceremonial uniform, the boy's face lit up with the same wonder that had moved James 2 years earlier. But now Thomas was older and more articulate, and he approached James with a maturity that showed how much he had grown. The boy thanked James formally for making his dream come true, and explained how that moment had inspired him to learn more about military history and service. What Thomas shared next moved James deeply. The boy revealed that he had started a small project at his school, teaching other children about the importance of military service and the traditions of the Queen's Guard. He had used the story of his encounter with James as the centerpiece of his presentations, explaining how real soldiers combined strength with kindness. Sarah, now using a wheelchair full-time but with eyes that still sparkled with determination, expressed her gratitude to James for understanding that sometimes the most important battles are fought in small moments of human connection. She explained that his simple gesture of returning Thomas's salute had given their family hope during one of their darkest periods and had shown Thomas that heroes were real people who chose to do the right thing even when it was difficult. During the ceremony, James found himself in an unprecedented position. He was asked to stand beside the podium as Sarah gave her speech, representing not just his own actions but the broader values of the Queen's Guard. Her words painted a picture of how small acts of compassion could ripple outward, creating waves of positive change that touched lives in ways the original actor might never fully understand. Sarah spoke about the importance of teaching children that strength and gentleness were not opposites but partners in true leadership. She described how James's moment of humanity had become a teaching tool in their family, helping Thomas understand that following rules was important, but knowing when to lead with your heart was even more valuable. The audience, which included senior military officials, members of the royal household, and families from across the country, listened with rapt attention as Sarah continued her remarks. She revealed that Thomas had written letters to other Queen's Guards, thanking them for their service and sharing what he had learned about honor and duty. Many of those letters had been forwarded to palace officials, creating a dialogue between the guards and the communities they served. As Sarah concluded her speech, she made an unexpected announcement. Thomas had been selected to participate in a special youth leadership program designed to teach young people about service and civic responsibility. The program was partly inspired by his own story and would give him opportunities to work with veterans and military families, continuing the cycle of service that had begun with a simple salute. Thomas then surprised everyone by asking if he could say something to James directly. With the microphone lowered to his height, the 10-year-old spoke with a clarity and purpose that amazed the adult audience. He thanked James not just for the salute, but for showing him that real heroes weren't just characters in stories. They were people who chose to care about others even when nobody was watching. The boy's words hit James with unexpected force. He realized that his journey over the past 2 years hadn't just changed him. It had created a legacy that would continue long after he hung up his uniform. Thomas represented the future generation of leaders, young people who would grow up understanding that true strength came from the courage to show compassion. After the ceremony, James had the opportunity to speak privately with Sarah and Thomas. Sarah shared that her health had stabilized somewhat, giving their family precious additional time together. She credited the positive memories and experiences, including their encounter with James, with helping her maintain hope and strength during her most difficult treatments. Thomas had prepared a special gift for James, a hand-drawn picture showing a Queen's Guard saluting a small boy, with words written around the border that read, "Heroes help heroes." The artwork was simple but profound, capturing the essence of their connection and the lesson that had emerged from their meeting. As James accepted the drawing, he reflected on how much his understanding of service had evolved. When he first put on the uniform, he thought being a Queen's Guard meant standing perfectly still and following orders without question. Now he understood that the highest form of service meant being responsive to human need while maintaining the dignity and values that the uniform represented. The ceremony concluded with an unexpected honor for James himself. Captain Morrison announced that James was being promoted to corporal, with particular recognition for his ability to represent the finest traditions of the Queen's Guard while adapting to serve the needs of the community. The promotion came with increased responsibilities, including mentoring new guards and helping to develop training programs that emphasized both discipline and compassion. In his brief acceptance remarks, James spoke about the lessons he had learned from the people he had encountered during his service. He explained that the true measure of a guard's success wasn't just in following protocol, but in understanding when protocol served its purpose and when human need required a different response. James acknowledged that his journey had been guided by the people he had helped: Thomas and his family, Arthur the veteran, Elena the young Romanian woman, and Margaret the charity founder. Each encounter had taught him something different about courage, service, and the responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. As the event concluded and guests began to depart, Thomas approached James one final time. The boy, now confident and articulate, shook James's hand formally and said something that would stay with the Guard for the rest of his career. Thomas told him that he had decided he wanted to serve his country when he grew up, inspired by the example of soldiers who knew how to be both strong and kind. Walking back to his quarters that evening, James carried Thomas's drawing carefully, treating it as the precious gift it was. He thought about the unexpected path his career had taken, from rigid rule follower to someone who understood that the most important rules were often unwritten, the rules of human decency, compassion, and courage. The drawing now hangs framed in James's office, where he mentors young guards and teaches them that true honor comes not from blind obedience, but from the wisdom to know when duty calls for strength and when it calls for gentleness. His story has become part of the informal training curriculum, helping new guards understand that the Queen's Guard serves not just the crown, but the people who look to them as symbols of the finest qualities of service. James's journey from protocol to compassion had come full circle, creating a legacy that would influence generations of guards to come. In learning to balance duty with humanity, he had discovered that the most powerful traditions were those that remained strong enough to bend without breaking, flexible enough to serve human need while maintaining their essential character. The boy who had saluted him with such hope and respect had grown into a young man who understood that true heroes were made not by following rules perfectly, but by knowing when to follow their hearts in service of something greater than themselves. And in that understanding, both James and Thomas had found their own paths to honor.